Hello, I'm Professor James Giordano of the Defense Medical Ethics Center and Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. And in today's lecture, we'll be discussing ethical issues in research and the use of emerging biosciences and technologies. Bioscience and technology, very often colloquially referred to as bio-S&T, literally puts human biology from the level of the cell all the way to the level of interaction of human systems with other systems within our social domain at our own fingertips. It essentially allows us to become, if you will, the engineers of not only our own capability, our own resilience, and our own recovery, but perhaps our own evolution. The domains of bioscience and technology can basically be parsed into three categorical dimensions. Those fields of bioscience and technology that can be used to assess our biology and physiology, chemistry, structure, and function. Those that can be used to intervene, and those that are derivative and in many ways become force multipliers for that science and technology to be realized in clinical and other contexts. If we look at each of these, we see that for assessment biosciences and technology, we include things such as state-of-the-art biomarkers that are available on a variety of scales, from the molecular all the way to the mass effect. Genetic and genomic evaluations and phenotypic evaluations, which include things such as phenotyping, genotyping, genomic indicators, and genomic populational indicators. Various forms of imaging, probably the most notable, neuroimaging, that allows us to literally peer into the living brain in increasingly real time and at a variety of levels, from almost the synaptic to the entire scale or phenomena of what's occurring in the brain as an organized set of nodes and networks. And that allows us to model and map. Certainly, that's been an incentive in my area of science and technology, which is the brain sciences. But understanding the brain-body interaction and understanding how connectomics overall, both within the brain and within neural networks and other bodily networks, circulatory networks, lymphatic networks, other forms of communicative networks between organ systems, provides us great capability to assess human structure and function on a range of levels that are both applicable and, in some cases, accessible and affectable in clinical medicine. And in reality, what we must do is we must take a look at biosciences and technology through a three-faceted lens. That three-faceted lens allows us to engage what are referred to as the 3 A's of assessment, access, and affecting human capability of structure and function. Affecting human capability. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you, as sure as there's a big old Tyrolean nose on my face, that many of the things that are right now at the cutting edge, at the laboratory bench, that are literally conceptual ideas in bioengineering will be realized within perhaps a less than 60 calendar month period to then be translated to bedside use. That translational window of bench to bedside, which in the past had been measured in relative years, is now being viewed in months. And increasingly what we're seeing is global enterprise in bioscience and technology is accelerating that pathway, those throughput times, ever more. The reality of going from a concept to a usable construct for clinical practice and other uses in the public sphere is becoming ever more realized within 4 to 5 year timeframes. So although 60 calendar months represents a viable target, certainly for research agendas here in the United States, more ambitious targets, 40 months, 48 months, for realization of utilizing new bioengineered techniques and technologies that can be put to their roles in clinical medicine and a variety of different other paramedical approaches has become ever more the norm. And understand as well that the ability to assess key concepts of structure and functional relationships in the body provides us opportunities to develop affectable targets for intervention. These targets include such things as Technopharmaceutics. In other words, the use of various technologies to be added to pharmaceutics to therefore allow greater specificity and precision of how various drugs and chemicals can both access various bodily compartments and affect those bodily compartments and key sites of action that minimize side effects, deleterious effects, and in many cases provide a much more precision approach to medicine that allows ever lower doses to be utilized to then engage and augment the body's amplification responses. In other words, pinpointing, sharpshooting versus buckshotting. Emerging techniques in gene editing, perhaps the most famous being the CRISPR-Cas9 gene scissoring tool, allows the capability to modify the human genome on a variety of levels and at a variety of stages throughout the lifespan, literally from the prenatal stage all the way to the terminal points in human existence, inclusive of the capability of modifying the human genome in those ways that are able to repair the genetic basis of cellular detritus, and in that way, perhaps lengthen the human lifespan, and not only do so temporally, but do so qualitatively. Evermore, we're recognizing that things on a variety of scales are important to incorporate in our approach to medicine, and the nanoscalar approach has not gone unnoticed or unaccessed or used. The development of nano-engineered materials and nano devices, what are sometimes referred to as nanobots, that merely 5 years ago seemed to be the stuff of science fiction, are now becoming ever more the norm. And the idea of robotic types of materials that can be externally controlled and directed to key sites in the body that are working on the subcellular scale represents the current state of much of where medicine is going. The ability to utilize nanomaterials and nanotype frameworks to be able to access subcellular components to be able to treat things like cancers, neurological disorders, and to be able to change the structure of cells so as to alter the function of cells, organs, and systems is evermore a key focus of research with a translational desire. And the idea of technopharmaceutics, gene editing, and nanomaterial implants also can be coupled to a whole host of modulatory approaches that utilize electricity, magnetism, and in some cases, ultrasonic forces. Here we're talking about transcranial and transcavity modulation, such things as transcranial direct current and alternating current stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, ultrasonic stimulation, and the use of a variety of trans-tissue electrical and trans-tissue magnetic systems that are then able to alter not only neurological function, but the functions of the target tissues that are innervated. But of course, working through the body's systems in ways that involve some donnable or doffable equipment, while useful, while scalable, and perhaps even while fieldable, can in some cases produce more of a blanketing effect rather than the precision effect that seems to be de rigueur evermore in medicine. And to do that, we've explored things like transcranial modulation, originally used to treat movement disorders, such as those resulting from neurodegenerative diseases, inclusive of Parkinson's disease, and then evermore being used to treat things like dystonia, essential tremor, and being explored to treat a variety of psychiatric conditions. Sophistications in the technologies and the methods of deep brain stimulation have allowed the use of nanomaterial implants and deep brain stimulation to be linked to brain-computer and bodily-computer interfaces to develop advanced bioprosthetics to repair broken structures and to restore them to not only their prior level of functionality, but perhaps to an enhanced or expanded window and capability of functionality. Programs such as DARPA's haptics program have allowed the use of integrated biocircuits to create bioprosthetics that are not only capable in terms of their execution, but are also capable in terms of the feedback they provide to the user. These are sensory-capable bioprosthetics that can, in fact, be directly linked, in other words, hardwired into the neurological system to provide cutting-edge, state-of-the-art repair for individuals who have suffered trauma, who have suffered degenerative diseases, who have suffered limb amputation as a consequence of cancer or other diseases. And as such, what we find is that increasingly the viability and the public amenability to accessing, utilizing, and acquiring such prosthetics is spreading. And more than that, what we're seeing is that the use of such prosthetics is going beyond the clinic, such that the use of prosthetics might offer means for individuals to become instrumented, to become more capabilized, to essentially become part of the Internet of Things by virtue of implantable or donnable and doffable bodily computer interfaces and prosthetics that allow them to engage a network of bioscience and technology to create, if you will, a user community of both persons and patients that provide real-time access to their information 24/7. Now, on the clinical side, certainly we can see that this provides some benefit. The ability to assess individuals before they slip onto that slope of patienthood so as to keep them well, to maintain their health, to maintain their resiliency, to maintain their relative resistance to injury and disease can be seen as a boon. But this too then opens perhaps a Pandora's box. And this is where we get into some of the derivative technologies. Obviously, to utilize these types of systems, to integrate these systems, to enable the accommodation, accumulation, synthesis, storage, and real-time use of these data in ways that are non-anonymized requires a tremendous amount of computational capability and power. And here we see the use of artificial networks and artificial intelligence technologies that have become, if you will, force multipliers. In other words, they are enablers for these technologies to be realized in the applications and communities of medicine and perhaps other domains of public life that make them as capable and potent as they can be. And this really speaks to the construct of integrative scientific convergence in bioscience and technology. Part of the reason that we see the wave of bio-S&T not only gaining in its momentum, but gaining its height and its power is that the science is becoming ever more de-siloed, increasingly unified in approaching various problems, solving those problems, developing new techniques and new technologies, and in that way, perhaps generating problems anew. This new paradigm, the integrative scientific convergent paradigm, is seen as a tremendous asset to clinical translational medicine. The ability to take a concept and realize that concept into a usable construct, a toolkit of instruments, of ideas, of methods that can then be put into practice in a relatively short amount of time due to the cooperative interfacing of these scientific disciplines that include the natural sciences, biotechnology and bioengineering, the anthropological and social sciences, to be able to determine where there is social need and or anthropological need for this level of clinical interface, which certainly includes not only fixing things after they're broken, but will increasingly address the ability to keep things working and or to optimize certain aspects of human structure and function so as to literally keep them off of, once again, that proverbial slope of change, of aging, of decrement, of vulnerability to insult, injury, and to those things that provide those changes in our body and our function as a consequence of the human lifespan. And what this allows us to do is focus upon the assessment, access, and manipulation of biological structures and groups. And once again, to do this requires a tremendous amount of data accumulation, integration, sharing, and use, which then brings us squarely into the camp of big data. So when we're considering bioscience and technology, we have to consider those derivative aspects, big data aspects, and all of the issues that big data then raises for things like privacy, protection, provenance, custodianship, and the prospective use of data as we begin to learn more and more about the systems of the human body and the individuals in whom those systems are in fact embodied. And this then allows us a view into the potential as well as real domains of use. Clearly, the low-hanging fruit is within the realm of clinical medicine. In other words, wanting to do good, the principal aim of medicine, and the reason you're entertaining these lectures in the ethics of medicine, is that ethics is all about systematic approaches to the study and articulation of what humans in defined communities explicate to be good. In other words, how can we do these goods? What are the best interests of those patients who are the moral subjects of our clinical regard? And in many ways, what we recognize is these new developments in bioscience and technology provide great insights and tremendous capabilities for us to affect the human predicament of insult, injury, decrement of function as a consequence of congenital conditions and or the lifespan, disease, and the lifespan itself. So without doubt, the quote, low-hanging fruit is the benevolent wanting to do good goals of medicine. Taking those things from the bioscientific and technological research bench and putting them translationally into bedside practice is the aim. But really, we have to ask, what is bedside practice? And for military medicine, does bedside practice end at the bedside, or does it go beyond? And clearly, this then represents the domain of military occupational and preventative medicine. And we see the use of bioscience and technology in these paraclinical and occupational domains as well. How can we employ the latest and greatest developments in bio-S&T to maximize training, to increase performance, and through training and performance, to increase the health, well-being, occupational protection, and enablement of our fighting force? Well, clearly, this has not gone unnoticed by the national security and military community, not only as regards military medicine per se, but the ability of bioscience and technology to have applications more broadly in national security, intelligence, and defense, inclusive of the capability of these bioscientific techniques and tools to be duly used in research of concern to develop viable weapons. Well, here we are, status post-COVID, if you will. We're coming to what may be a transitional point in the COVID crisis. And as we continue forward, there is ongoing discussions as to whether or not a biosecurity threat such as COVID, although a naturally occurring threat, and perhaps a naturally occurring threat that involved certain improprieties and laboratory security regulations and practices, but nevertheless a naturally occurring threat, could be representative of other biosecurity threats that are not only natural, but perhaps are man-made or man-modified. And can we, in fact, utilize current bioscience and technology to develop those types of instruments and methods to then leverage domains of power and capability on the global stage? And what are our near-peer competitors doing in these areas that we in military medicine must at least be aware of, if not on the research side, on the clinical side, so as to be prepared for not only the possibility, but various probabilities that emerging areas of bioscience and technology will then become emerging risks and threats to public safety and national security. And if we're examining what those public safety threats may be, another very important domain is that the public is gaining access to bioscience and technologies at a heretofore unprecedented rate and scope. Direct-to-consumer companies are offering a whole host of bioscientific and technological products to the population at large that can be used for educational, wellness, and lifestyle ends. And there is a growing and notable do-it-yourself community, the colloquial biohacker community, that has rich content both on the white web and the dark web, and has become an increasing focus of international concern, not necessarily because the community per se represents something capricious or nefarious, but the vulnerability of that community to potential purloinment, infiltration, manipulation, and misuse by states, non-state actors, and proxies has not gone without some level of consideration, which is why there are ongoing programs from the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation and internationally via Interpol to at least maintain cordial, if not considerate, and in some cases, surveillance relations with much of the do-it-yourself community so as to maintain a relative level of security and prevent against that volatility and vulnerability to purloinment. But the reason it's important to bring that up in this context is that given an open society as we have here in the United States, an open and liberal democracy, individuals' capability to work within the scope of the law to engage, if you will, backyard science, public and community science, is not only a possibility, not only a probability, but can actually be viewed as a right, if and as long as such science does not transgress the capabilities of the community and or the law to, number one, regulate it and or to ensure public safety. But here too is a thin line. What I do to myself may in fact represent an area of my expressed autonomy. In other words, if I can self-manipulate, if I can self-biohack, if I can get things over the internet, if I can get things directly from a consumer and commercial organization, well, as a consequence, I'm allowed to do certain things to myself. I'm allowed to self-instrument. And the reason we bring this up here is that this is something not only you might see, but increasingly you will see in your clinical practices. Individuals who have utilized direct-to-consumer products, resources, and services, individuals who have engaged direct-to-consumer products to then participate in or to develop do-it-yourself practices of biomanipulation, biohacking, if you will, for educational, lifestyle, wellness, and even social purposes. Might be something that you encounter in the clinic and will be something that you encounter in the clinic. How will you deal with this? What does this mean? Well, I think in this way, it also becomes important to understand that when we look at bioscience and technology, again, the driving force of any of it is doing good, the desire to do good, benevolence. One could argue, and I think defensibly so, that any one of these initiatives in bioscience and technology, irrespective of where they're occurring in the world or who's doing them, aims at some definable good. But here I think it's important to paraphrase the virtue philosopher Alistair McIntyre's question of, well, who's good? According to which rationality? What justice? In other words, what I view as good for me might necessarily not be good for you. And or what you view as good for you, I might not view as a good at all. And then the other question becomes, well, what does that good entail? Does that good entail maximizing capabilities of resistance and resilience? Or is it solely to be oriented towards things like recuperation and recovery? And this is where we really have to get into at least some discussion of what might be the ethics of preventive occupational medicine versus reactive occupational medicine, or just preventive medicine and reactive medicine writ large. And how much of a community and individual focus is first and foremost realistic, and second of all, viable. Given the fact that there is a direct-to-consumer market of much of bioscience and technology, and there is a do-it-yourself community, the truth of the issue is that more and more we will see the end products and the end effects of the use of these techniques and technologies, these tools and these products and these methods in the clinic, and even among our armed forces personnel. But let's back up a step. If once again the driving force is benevolence, then we have to explore that from an ethical perspective of what that benevolence obtains and entails. In clinical contexts, certainly health is a benevolent motive. But obviously working within military medicine, we're also talking about operational performance and protection. And in that regard, through our training and through our preventive medicine, we're seeking to enhance certain aspects of structure and function so as to keep the military intelligence operator safe when in harm's way. We're working, if you will, proactively versus reactively. Colloquially, this is referred to as working left of bang. And this on its own incurs a host of ethical issues. Is working left of bang in these areas of bioscience and technology that are afforded towards some preventive means actually nothing more than enhancement? And if it is enhancement, what should be enhanced? Who should be enhanced? How far should such enhancements go? And what will it mean on more of a socio-political level if, in fact, enhancement becomes the norm and the basis for the new normal shifts? So in sum, what we're seeing is that indeed, bioscience and technology allows us to not only put our biology and our structure and our function at our fingertips, through the capabilization of big data, through the capabilization of the ubiquity of the information, products, and deliveries that are viable over the internet, it puts human fingertips upon many biologies and the individuals and groups that have those biologies. And in so doing, the ethical issue here is that bioscience and technology has the reality and potential to harness and engage its tools and its methods in convergent, multidisciplinary approaches to study, define, and predict human ecologies, how humans as individuals and groups interact. This essentially brings us back to the idea of biosoma, B-I-O, bio, S-O, so, ma, a phrase first coined by the late George Bulgarello, the dean of the New York Institute of Technology, who viewed humans as an integration of their biology, their social structure, and the use of machines as tools. No doubt humans are tool users, and although other species are, I would think unarguably humans have ascended to the top of that relative ziggurat of capability. And in so doing, our tool use has allowed us to become engineers of our own design and of our own environments. And bioscience and technology is such that it focuses that capability inward with an expression outward. It allows us through our bioscience and technological means to affect human activities on individual groups and perhaps populational levels. And this influences postures and conducts of national security and defense agendas because through bioscience and technology, we're able to affect individuals' capabilities. And in affecting individuals' capabilities, that affords both individuals, groups, and, if you will, the nations and politics they represent, not only capability, but power. And even if we take one step back and examine biotechnology as a viable good, we have to ask, who gets the goodies? Certainly, if I have the capability to utilize my biotechnology to obtain and sustain a high level of health, to maximize occupational performance and protection, and to enable individuals to do particular things that keep them off of the slope of injury, insult, and disease, well, that affords discriminable benefit. The key word here is discriminable. Who gets them? And what does that then mean for the biotechnologically and bioscientifically enabled haves versus have-nots? And these questions bring us right into the field of examining the potential good, the potential bad, and what might be the ugly of bioscientific and biotechnological uses in practice. Once again, I think the goods are evident: to diagnose, cure, and in some cases, treat and prevent diseases, conditions, and injuries. And if we're talking about preventing diseases and injuries, well, then obviously that involves some improvement in our physiological and our cognitive functions to keep us more resistant or at least resilient when these things happen, because these things are, in fact, the nature of life. And that's what we're looking to do here, aren't we? I mean, we're utilizing bioscience and technology to improve the quality of life, lessen the human predicament, and overall improve the human condition in our work, in our daily lives, in our social sphere. But in our social sphere, in our daily lives, we also have to be mindful of the fact that the assessment technologies can be utilized to develop norms and or their findings can be misappropriated, and or their meanings can be taken out of context, miscommunicated, and in some cases, frankly manipulated. But not only the findings of what represents norm versus abnorm, function versus dysfunction, but clearly then how we use that information to then target those substrates for treatments. Those treatments to keep individuals healthy, to keep individuals occupationally protected and capabilized, and to, in some cases, enable, empower, and enhance individuals. Which then brings us back to the previous question. Who's going to get these goodies? Which then raises the possibility for distributional asymmetries of capability and ultimately power. This is what the French postmodern philosopher Michel Foucault referred to as biopower, and when leveraged on a larger scale within organizations, biopolitics, to affect individuals' biologies in those ways that yields power over them, or to affect individuals' biologies in ways that are powerful that then yield capabilities of hegemony and leverage over other groups. And that brings us right into the ugly domain, the intentional misuse of information and capabilities that bioscience and biotechnology affords and provides. And at very least, perhaps, the neglect of analysis, precaution, and preparation for what bioscience and biotechnologies may yield. Ladies and gentlemen, if we've learned nothing from the COVID crisis, it's that in many ways we are bio-psycho-socio-politically and economically vulnerable from a point of eminence of our own biologies. Something as simple, yet as elegant as a virus for which there was no known treatment or cure, rendered the world virtually helpless for a period of time as we struggled to find viable treatments and vaccines. A naturally occurring effect, whether or not there were any misappropriations of biological security in laboratories, is not an issue here. But what bioscience and technology certainly affords is the ability to modify human structure and function, as well as the structure and function of other biological organisms. And in so doing, we must be analytic in what those capabilities yield, and not just adapt a precautionary principle or a simple precautionary principle, but rather adapt a preparedness principle. Why? Because a simple precautionary principle would yield that in any situation where the risks or harms might outweigh the benefits, simply don't go there. That's far too simplistic. The reason being is, as we'll learn in a moment, the possibility, if not probability, for risks, burdens, and harms of a new bioscience and technology sometimes are not initially apparent. Or what was initially apparent will not be the case, and what actually becomes manifests itself only as a consequence of time. So at very, very least, we have to be prepared for the fact that things not only can go wrong, but things will go wrong. That there will be some either non-intentional or intentional misuse of the information and the capabilities, and or that these things may be used in some form of warfare, either kinetically or non-kinetically. Working within the realm of military medicine, understanding each and all of those domains, from the clinical medical all the way up to the kinetic in warfare, is certainly within the portfolio of the military medical practitioner, as are the ethical, legal issues and risks. In the main, we can break these down into two major categories, those that are directly focal and arising from the technology, and those that are somewhat derivative based upon the technology's patterns of utilization or non-utilization in the various social structures and milieus in which it is going to be employed. Those that are focal to the technology include the fact that these are new technologies, and at the frontiers of what is known and what is unknown, things always can be a bit risky. We're dealing with unknowns. We haven't been doing this science and technology for decades. We haven't been translating into clinical and or public use for decades, and as a consequence, what the technology and what the science actually does, not only in the short term, but in the intermediate and long term, remains an unknown. And of course, this also speaks to what are the actual capabilities and limitations of the science and tech, which then reflects back upon the validity and viability of its use. The hope that we instill in bioscience and technology might be exaggerative, might be amplified, might be overblown, or in some cases, we might underrepresent its potential utility and or the scope of its effects. And those effects must be considered to be either runaway or what are known as Wechselblad effects. Runaway effects are exactly as the name would imply, that the technology, either the technology and science itself, or the call for, the need for, the demand for the technology runs away. I think this is probably best illustrated fictionally through the film Limitless. Here we see a new drug, a fictional drug, NZT, that provided the individual with great neurocognitive capability. The drug was originally to be designed to be able to treat individuals with some form of cognitive impairment or some type of cognitive dysfunction. Again, the adage, the myth, the morality play is as old as human history. We see such things in antiquity. Obviously, the concept of Dr. Faustus speaks to the idea of if I gain unlimited knowledge and power, what am I trading? The Faustian bargain. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the effects of the drug were not limitless in terms of what the cognitive capabilities in the individual were. What became limitless was the desire for it. In other words, there was a runaway aspect of the desire, the pull, the social need, the demand. On the other side of the proverbial fence is something known as Wechselblad effects. I think probably more simply defined as unanticipated consequences. In other words, if our bioscience and technology is modifying biological structure and function in ways that were heretofore not possible, well, we simply don't know what the results of that will be. If we're going to refer back to a science fiction film, because I think they do provide at least a good window into possibilities, albeit fictionalized and with creative license, here I refer you to the wonderful film Mimic. The idea of doing good as the low-hanging fruit was certainly the goal for execution of a large-scale genetic project. But what are the effects of that genetic manipulation in the long term? And are we ready for those effects? And when we talk about are we ready, the we we're talking about here is the social milieu, both within the community of the military and beyond. Here we're talking about whether or not we can manipulate mind and whether this then represents an intrusion of what the philosopher, ethicist, and cognitive scientist Nita Farahany refers to as cognitive liberties. Certainly, it deals with issues of autonomy. If we're talking about big data and the use of bioscience and technology to instrument individuals to allow real-time access for their protection, whether within the military or beyond, we have to balance protection and privacy. In an open society, at very least, one would expect that there's going to be some level of consent and informed consent. But that then brings us to the question of how informed can we be about new aspects of bioscience and technology, given the technologically focal unknowns that we just discussed? How aware, how understanding can we be of the science and technology to be able to provide consent? And if we afford consent, will we be transparent in the communication of the availability or non-availability of continuity of research and clinical care? What represents treatment? What represents protection? What represents enhancement? In whom? What norms? What do we do with diverse populations where differences exist in genotype and phenotype? And again, the idea is who gets these things and how do they get them? If bioscientific and technological treatments, left of bang or right of bang, represent the reality in military medicine, what do we do when the individual is no longer in the military? What does that then mean for individuals who have access to certain forms of bioscience and technology within the military, but not within the civilian world, or vice versa? And then clearly, what does this also infer for the state of warfare in the 21st century? Much of the bioscience and technology that is being developed and is being articulated does not necessarily fall within the current scope and language of the biological toxins and weapons or chemical weapons conventions. And as such, considering such dual use may require revisitation and or revision of those signatory treaties and others that will evermore conjoin military medicine in the need to appreciate what the medical effects may be, both in the short and long term. So how do we do this? Well, I think one thing that becomes important to appreciate is that bioscience and technology is a field in evolution and of rapid growth and rapid pace. My research group has likened it to an international Formula One superspeedway. And I think the analogy obtains. Multiple lanes, multiple entries of high tech, a very rapid pace, highly competitive, big prizes on a variety of levels, not only monetary and economic, but reputational, as well as affecting, if you will, the scope and tenor of the field, what represents the new standard of care, of practice, of science and tech. But like any other multiple lane, multiple entry, rapid pace and competitive event, it's not without risks, not only for those on the track, but those around it. So if in fact this is something we are already on, then I think it becomes very important to understand that there need to be methods to get aboard. In other words, we need to navigate this relatively safety, or at least with a safety that allows us to appreciate where the risks lie, so as to try to mitigate and prevent those risks. This is what our research group has referred to as the on-ramp program. Get it? Speedway. On-ramp. Operational necessary risk assessment and mitigation paradigm. It involves three major categorical domains of assessment and risk mitigation. It begins with a 6R generalized approach. In other words, if you want to learn how to drive, that's what this is all about. It demands responsibility for realistic assessment of the bioscience and technology, responsibility for research evaluating the use and effects of said bioscience and tech in practice, responsiveness to burdens and deleterious effects, and revisions in the technology and the way the technology is marketed and the way the technology is distributed and made available. And those revisions very often will demand responsible regulation to ensure rigor in the development and claims. But taking that 6R approach poses key questions that must be framed within the defined parameters. So we go from 6Rs to 6Ws. Part of this preparatory paradigm in any consideration of using bioscience and technology should be informed by key questions. What bioscience and tech is or are available for current use? Why is bioscience and tech being considered or advocated for use in this particular situation, circumstance, or case? Who will receive the bioscience and tech? When will it be considered? In other words, what is the algorithm? What protocol? When in a treatment algorithm or treatment plan will cutting-edge bioscience and technologies be considered? Early on or later after everything else fails? When do we bring out the proverbial big guns, or at least the new guns? Where will it be administered? Hospital, clinic, school, worksite, home? And are there mechanisms, and which mechanisms will or will not be in place for the ongoing provision of research services, research resources, and clinical services, resources, and care? And then these questions and their respective answers must be framed by what we refer to as 6C considerations. And here, as always, I take a deep bow of homage to my longstanding colleague, former Lieutenant Colonel and Dr. William Casebeer, formerly of the United States Air Force and DARPA, who talked about the 3C approach, very much the same way we approach the quality of a diamond, in looking at the quality of any emerging neuroscientific or bioscientific and technological development. Working together with Dr. Casebeer, we expanded that to the 6C considerations, consideration of the real capacities of that bioscience and tech, the real things. In other words, let's not overemphasize or underemphasize. Let's not cry wolf or engage chicken little discourses. What can the thing really do, and what are the limitations, not only of the bioscience and tech, but of the institutions, organizations, and users, as well as stake and shareholders in that bioscience and tech, to use it responsibly? What are the consequences that are going to be incurred by the use of that bioscientific and technological development or method on its recipients, their families, and society in the short, intermediate, and relatively long term? What is the character of the research and the use of this bioscience and technique? In other words, what are we using it for? And how will it then affect the character of the recipient, their patterns of physiological function, cognition, emotion? What are the contexts of need and value that are important to be considered in using bioscience and technology. And obviously, what is most proximate for us is the military. Are we using this in accordance with military ethics, medical ethics, science, technology, and social ethics? Should we consider the ethics of circumstance and/or culture? Each and all of these contexts are important to bring into this discourse so as to be able to create some quasi-calculus of ethical responsibility. Because those very same contexts may indeed influence, inform, and in that way articulate the availability or non-availability of continuity of research and clinical care, which we see as an important contingency for consent. At very least, it becomes important to tell those individuals who are potential recipients of cutting-edge bioscience and technology what resources will or will not be available for them with regard to studying them further and providing care for them if, in fact, something goes wrong. Will that be available throughout their tenure in the military? Will that be available, for example, when communicated over to the VA? If things are done in the civilian world and then taken into military service, what are the responsibilities for continuity of research and clinical care in those circumstances? It's a fairly large plate that needs to be handled, but we argue that we must do the 6 R's, 6 W's, and 6 C's if, in fact, we're going to responsibly and genuinely consider the ethical basis of how any new bioscience and technology could be used and or should be used. And what this really demands is a reality check. First and foremost, a reality check of the bioscience and technology that is being considered for use, but also a reality check of the bioethical approaches that can be used to evaluate it and adjudicate its use in practice. In some cases, what we recognize is that a heterogeneous bioethical approach is necessary, and it's one that I advocate all along. As you've heard in other lectures in this series, the need to develop, if you will, a tool belt, a utility belt, a toolkit of bioethical approaches and capabilities increases the effectiveness of utilizing ethics in real-world enterprises and endeavors to gain a good effect. In other words, understanding what are your duties, what are the anticipatory goods? In other words, what is the utility of putting those duties into practice within the context in which you're going to actually articulate whatever enterprise that is? What are the needs of that community? What are the values of care? And then ultimately, how do you, as a virtuous agent, utilize your intellectual and moral virtues to navigate that terrain in real-world time and space? My research group has said that current ethical principles might not be enough, given the increasingly expanding capabilities that these emerging bioscientific and technological developments yield. We may need to embellish some of the fundamental principles to include such things such as non-obsolescence, self-performativity, and self-enablement, the idea of citizenship. Each and all might need to be considered in the context of use. But more than that, if we're revising and we're expanding what might be our ethical view and capabilities to be able to benevolently utilize cutting-edge bioscience and technology in medical practice and beyond, it becomes important to continually examine the medical social views and the expectations of both the science and tech and what ethics are. And that is very important because, as I've said before and will say once again, ethics may have a very, very big mouth and can shout loudly from the pulpit of direction, of prescription and proscription. But far too often, it is a mouth with very little or no teeth. Teeth of the sort that can take a bite out of the realities of what is and what will be represents regulation, law, and policies. And ultimately, what we're looking to do is to understand the bioscience and tech in terms of its capabilities, its limitations, and its contexts of use, to be able to understand the risks, the benefits, the threats, burdens, and harms that could be rendered by various trajectories of use, and put that into a bioethical framework that is based upon principled duty, utility, and practice within a community, an exercise of intellectual and moral virtues by the agents who are then going to be the responsible producers as well as engagers, those who essentially are the providers of what this bioscience and technology can afford in clinical and extraclinical contexts. What do we expect? What do we expect for our personnel in the military? What do we expect them to do, to be? What does society expect of the military? What does the military and military medicine expect of bioscience and technology? And what do we expect of our current ethics and our ethics in the near term, given the fact that bioscience and technology is not something that, quote, we're doing, but is an ever more global phenomenon and may in fact be one of the tools that many of our global near peer and strategically latent competitors is utilizing to improve the capabilities of their population, of their military, of its mission, of its sustainability, and of its power. And then what does that mean, not only for our domestic policies, both within the military and at large, but what does that mean? Then we then go to the international discussion and bargaining table of global regulation, global policy, and global law. It asks the question, what will be? Que sera? So let's cash the reality check. Use and practice of these bioscientific and biotechnological tools and methods will incur unanticipated and in some cases deleterious and burdensome effects. But the fact that things can and will go wrong does not necessarily prohibit or prescribe their use, but it does obligate a need for rigorous monitoring, continuing research and development on the biomedical side, ergo each and all of you, understanding of how to clinically engage this bioscience and technology in the real world scope of your practice, taking a grassroots effort, each and all of you being contributory to understanding the ethical utility or non-utility of various forms of bioscience and technology to inform revisable guidelines and regulations and ultimately bioethical and neuroethical guidance. Because moving forward, what we don't want to do is to untangle this relative Gordian knot of understanding human biology, structure, and function only to open a can of worms with the bioscientific and technological toolkits that we develop to do so. So the take-home message is, I think, a simple one. But it's one that has great meaning for me, and let me reiterate a story that I'm oft to tell in these contexts, and it's a personal story. And I think what it really reflects is that I'm probably turning into my father because this is something my father told me, and my father used to repeat his stories all the time. I mean, I can remember vividly my dad saying, "Have I told you this one?" "Yeah, Dad, at least 10 times, but you smile and nod. And the reason he's telling you is because he really thought it was good for you." So I'm turning into my dad and I'm relating a story about my dad to you. My dad was a nautical engineer. He was a submarine designer, worked for American Electric Boat. And as an engineer, he was pretty good with tools. He was a tinkerer. He liked to restore things and fix things. And that was our father and son activity. It's something I do to this day. I still work on airplanes, motorcycles, old cars, furniture. And my dad was a really good teacher as well. And what he used to do is introduce me to a new tool every month. And then we'd spend that month using that tool on some project. He'd bring that tool home the first Tuesday of every month. It was called New Tool Tuesday. And he started this when I was around 6 years old. And I remember one day I was about 10. So, I mean, do some simple math here. He started this when I was 6. I remember this when I was around 10. So I had about 48 to 50 tools under my sort of tool belt, so to speak. I mean, I kind of figured I knew what I was doing. I'd been doing this for 4 years. Let's face it, that was half of my life as a kid. And I remember he brings home this new tool, but for the life of me, I don't remember what it was. And we were working on some project down on the workbench, and I was so excited. It was New Tool Tuesday. It was like, "Hey, Dad, thanks." And I go running off to go jump into using this new tool on our project. I remember my dad put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Jim, slow down. You're going to have to measure twice and cut once when you use that because all too often you can't turn back." Wow, Dad, what great advice. Measure twice before we make the cut. Reflection, insight, prudence are all the key stepping stones for our current and future acts or inquiry, invention, and intervention with these emerging bioscientific methods and tools that are and soon will be at our fingertips. But before we put our fingers around that, I think it becomes important to measure what these bioscientific methods and tools can do, and also take measure of what we, as the stake and shareholders, as the arbiters of these tools, as the consumers and as the providers of these tools, are capable of doing with regard to their prudent, ethical use and practice. Let's measure twice and cut once, because all too often, there's simply no turning back. If you're interested in additional information about this topic, I refer you to some of the ongoing work of our research group at DMEC and in coordination with my research group at Georgetown. And if you're interested in getting in touch with me, please feel free. You can reach me at my Georgetown address, and that's james.giordano@georgetown.edu. And once again, I hope you found this lecture informative and interesting, and I thank you for your time. Have a good day.